back, guys. Today we are going to be looking at progressive political reform. Now, when you see the word political, I want you to be thinking about government systems, laws, political parties, voting rights. All of these things fall underneath our political sphere of analysis. So with today's progressive political reform, we're going to be looking at how the government and political parties and voting rights were affected by the progressive era. We're going to start off with something we've already talked about this unit and this semester, which is political machines. Remember from the Gilded Age, political machines were these groups of corrupt politicians that would control the politics in a city. They often exploited the poor and also immigrants in cities, exchanging favors for votes. And come to the progressive era, we want to see this practice end. It's a huge area of focus for progressives is ending political corruption. And so we see some muckrakers that are tackling political machines and corruption in general. We talked about Thomas Nast already. Remember, he was the cartoonist who used his cartoons to expose Boss Tweed. But his work was also influential in encouraging and inspiring other muckrakers to tackle government corruption. For example, Lincoln Steffens. He published a book called The Shame of Our Cities, in which he told people the way to solve government corruption was to vote out corrupt politicians. If enough people would just use the power of the vote to vote them out of power, then you could elect people that could actually represent your needs. So he encouraged people to vote their heart. Don't vote when you're pressured by political machines. Vote for who you want to vote for, who's actually going to do good things for you in the community. We also see that there's a greater movement to get people's voices heard more in the government. So an example of this would be the Wisconsin experiment that was created by Robert La Follette. La Follette was a progressive governor and senator from Wisconsin who believed that the common person's voice should be heard at all levels of government, and they should have more power in creating the laws and the legislation that governed their everyday lives. Basically, he wanted more of a direct democracy, which means that people directly participate in democratic ideals. So the Wisconsin experiment pushed the creation of 3 new political ideas. One was the initiative. This is the power of the citizens to create their own proposals or their own laws, essentially, that could be voted on by other citizens. The referendum is when citizens can vote on bills that are proposed by legislatures. So basically, a state or a local legislature would write a bill, and then the citizens would get to vote on whether or not they wanted that to become a law. And then the recall was a way to get rid of politicians that didn't seem to be doing their jobs properly. This is when citizens can vote to remove an elected official from office. So these 3 things made up the Wisconsin experiment. They were developed, in Wisconsin and implemented there first, and then later spread nationwide. Robert La Follette and other progressive politicians supported the 17th Amendment, which was the direct election of senators by average voters. Up until the 17th Amendment, which was passed in, I think, like the 1910s, the state legislatures or the state government from each state elected or chose the senators to go to Washington, D.C. to represent that state. And progressives believed that that just wasn't fair. It was limiting the voice of the common person in government. And so with the 17th Amendment, the average voter could vote not only for their representatives, but also vote for their senators, which would increase the political voice of the common person at the federal government level. We also see that states and the federal government implemented what were called direct primaries, which is when voters could choose which candidate they wanted to run for a specific office. An example of this today is when we have presidential elections. Both major political parties will have primaries where several people from the party say that they want to run for president for the party, and then the voters get to choose who of those people they want to run for president. And then we also see the development of the secret ballot. This is when when you go to vote, and I know that you guys haven't done this yet because you're not 18, but when you go to vote, you vote in like a little cubicle that has like little walls around you so that no one can see what your votes are. And this idea started in the progressive era because people were being pressured by political machines to vote a certain way. But now, if you could vote in secret, if you could cast your ballot privately, then you could vote really what your heart was saying rather than what the political machine was telling you to do. So, all of these things, the initiative, the referendum, the recall, the 17th Amendment, direct primaries, and the secret ballot, all of these things together limited the influence of political machines in government, as well as allowed more of the common people's voices to be heard at various levels of government as well. Lastly, I want to end today's notes by looking at a political system called socialism. You've probably heard the word socialism thrown around in recent years, but you might not know what that word actually means. So, socialism is an economic and political system. So, it governs like things that have to do with money, but also things that have to do with the government, that proposes that the government should completely regulate and control businesses and the economy, and that wealth should be distributed equally among the people. During the progressive era, this was super popular among poor workers because they're the ones who are getting the short end of the stick when it comes to the wealth gap. And they also feel like they're being denied very basic things like fair wages and reasonable working hours and sick leave and housing and food. They feel like they're not being provided these basic things and that the government should step in and control the wealth gap as well as provide all citizens with what they need to survive. The leader of the Socialist Party of America was Eugene Debs. We've talked about him before. He ran for president several times, including in the election of 1912. And he also founded the Industrial Workers of the World Union on these socialist principles about having the government regulate businesses and forcing businesses to pay certain wages and establish certain working hours and working conditions. As you can probably imagine, socialist ideas were a threat to the wealthy elite. They did not want their money taken away from them. They didn't want the government to force them to tell them what they had to pay workers. And so, because of this, he was targeted as a criminal and was put in jail multiple times. He actually ran for president from jail several times. You can see his mugshot over there. But being jailed for your beliefs isn't something that is specific to this time period. We're actually going to see in the 1920s something called the Red Scare, where communists are going to be targeted for their beliefs and thrown in jail as well. And then in the 1950s, we're going to have the second Red Scare, where it happens again during the Cold War. So we'll come back to this idea of people being targeted for their beliefs and thrown in jail for actually not committing crimes. We'll look at that several times this semester. Okay, so hopefully you were able to see with these notes today how the progressive era changes politics with the ending of political machines, also promoting direct democracy and more people's voices in the government, as well as the rise of socialism and why it was popular among specifically like poor workers during the progressive era.